This man is about to say something explosive.
We are in the midst of a rupture.
De la fin d'une fiction agréable et du début d'une réalité brutale.
That man was Mark Carney. But what did he mean? Was he saying the West was dead? Or the rules-based order? And if so, what comes next? Since he made that speech in January 2026, the world's geopolitical thinkers have been talking about little else. To examine what this wake-up call means and how reactions to it could change the world, I spoke with Nils Gilman. He's a historian and futurist at Berggruen Institute in Los Angeles. And he's one of those thinkers who were taken by Carney's speech.
First of all, the venue and who he is, I think, is really important. So he spoke at Davos, which for the last 30 plus years has been the kind of epicenter of the neoliberal order, the globalisation order. It's where powerful executives and political leaders come together to sort of create the kind of world that we lived in after the first Cold War up until very recently.
Did you notice? Gilman spoke of the first Cold War. That's because he believes we are already in the second one. That's something we'll return to later. He also says the fact it was Carney laying this out was a big deal.
And then Mark Carney himself, of course, is former head of the Bank of England, Prime Minister of Canada, could not be a more establishmentarian guy, right? So he goes to the seat of the global establishment, himself is a total establishmentarian, and then pronounces that the order over which the institutions that he's been affiliated with and the institution he's speaking in is dead and over.
The order is dead and over. He's talking here about what's usually referred to as the rules-based order. The idea that even if countries disagree on important issues, they can work together on economics, trade, and even security based on international law and agreed standards of behavior. What we know as the West had happily existed within that order, confident it had won the Cold War, and steering or arguably dominating international organizations spanning the globe. We're talking about organizations like NATO, the G7, the United Nations, the World Bank. This Western confidence rests on the United States, its economy, the world's biggest, and its military, the world's strongest. But not long before Carney's speech, that American foundation of collective Western power started to feel distinctly unstable. US President Donald Trump threatened to annex Greenland, a territory of Denmark, which is an EU member.
We need Greenland for national security.
He questioned fundamental alliances such as NATO, and he ignored rules of common trade. He even said he wanted to take over Canada.
They should be a state.
If the US is no longer a reliable partner, where does that leave the rest of the West? And remember, all of this is happening in the context of a worrying global situation. China is flexing its muscles towards Taiwan, expanding its nuclear arsenal, and has exploited its dominance over rare resources. While in Europe, Russia has invaded a neighbor, and in the Middle East, the US and Israel have launched a war against Iran. The challenge, said Carney, was what the non-superpowers should do next.
We know the old order is not coming back. We shouldn't mourn it. Nostalgia is not a strategy. But we believe that from the fracture, we can build something bigger, better, stronger, more just. This is the task of the middle powers.
Middle powers. This is a very interesting bit. These are the countries big enough to have some agency, some power, but which cannot stand up to a superpower alone. The superpowers of our age are the US and China, that is already certain. But the remnants of the West, including the Europeans, might work together and look around the world for partners to form a middle power movement.
And I do think that the Europeans in particular, do see themselves as a kind of, values aligned set of countries. I think they see other places that are potentially part of that, right? A democratic Brazil, a democratic Australia, a democratic Canada. These are places that I think European countries, middle powers, can very much see themselves as being in a bloc. Now, one way to think of that is it's the West all over again, minus Donald Trump's United States.
Remember when Gilman spoke about the Second Cold War? He argues that this time around there's a new global divide. Rather than communism and capitalism, or even East and West, the split now is over energy. He says the US is the petro superpower and China is the electro-superpower. At the moment, the US is working with Russia and other oil producers like the Gulf countries, as well as carbon business interests, to try to keep fossil fuels as the standard energy source of the world. At the same time, China is leading a huge expansion of the global renewable electricity industry. The question is, which countries will fully commit to electro-power? Because that will determine the balance of this new Cold War. And a decision on which way to jump will be for the long term.
This is one way in which this new Cold War, I think, is going to be somewhat different from the old Cold War. You could switch from, siding with the Soviets to siding with the Americans quite easily. That was just a matter of changing your ideological stripes. You can't change that easily if you're a country from being an electrostate to being a petrostate or vice versa.
That's because of infrastructure. Once a country has spent billions on wind farms and solar farms, or upgrading pipelines and refineries, that stuff and the contracts to supply or maintain them are fixed.
So I think the commitments that people are going to have to make are going to be much deeper and longer term.
And the thing is, no middle power is starting from scratch. Most of them are already deeply bound into the petro power system, and they're under significant pressure to stay there.
Certainly the United States, insofar as it continues to be led by a government like the current one, is going to put a lot of pressure on countries not to try to become fossil fuel independent or fossil fuel free. And they will use all sorts of things, bilateral pressures to put, incentives and threats to keep countries from making that kind of conversion to green tech and green energy and electric vehicles. That's already clear. I mean, they're doing that in a variety of ways.
It sounds like the middle powers have to change the way they see the United States.
We know the old order is not coming back.
But moving away from carbon and becoming an electrostate instead means siding with China, and that would carry major risks too.
I think the thing that many countries are and should be concerned with is if you make the green conversion and the supply chains continue to be dominated by the Chinese, at what point will the Chinese potentially use that as a point of leverage for other kinds of geopolitical purposes?
So, is there a way for middle powers to become less dependent on the US without becoming over-dependent on China?
29 nations.
It's been done before. Back in the 1950s, as the first Cold War took shape, about 100 nations decided they didn't want to belong to one side or the other. Many were former colonies with no intention of swapping their new independence for Soviet or American dependency. India was the biggest country in the non-aligned movement, joined by others like Egypt, Yugoslavia, and Indonesia. Could this be a blueprint for a new flexible movement of middle powers? Gilman suggests it could. He identifies some countries from what was the Old West, along with major players from the Global South, like Brazil, Nigeria, South Africa, India, Indonesia. This kind of grouping would have a chance, he reckons, of resisting pressure from both superpowers.
With the middle powers as a potential bloc, I think they have more opportunities for success because these are richer powers on the one hand, the European and Northeast Asian countries. And also in the emerging market bloc, or the post-colonial bloc, these are now countries that are not just coming out of colonialism. So I think that there are similarities in terms of wanting to have a group of powers that are steering between the superpowers, but I think they have more opportunities for success now than the original one did.
In terms of trade, there's already enormous traffic within this bloc. Agreements like the EU-India Free Trade Agreement, the EU-Mercosur, or the CPTPP cover massive volume and could arguably make these middle powers an economic superspace. But which way would they jump on the energy question? And could they make a decision while remaining independent of the US and China? Some middle powers have already taken significant steps away from the US-led petrobloc. Brazil with its hydropower schemes, and Australia with wind and solar. And there are some middle powers such as Canada and South Africa, which with their rare earth minerals are developing assets which could prevent them being pulled too far into China's orbit. There are signs that some of these countries are making political moves to take steps towards renewables. Together. Just in April, ministers from nearly 60 countries met in the Colombian city of Santa Marta for what is being called the first global conference explicitly aimed at phasing out fossil fuels. They called themselves a coalition of the willing. They bypassed the usual blockages faced by bigger groupings like the COP by carefully curating the invitation list. The US and China were not there.
I think there's many countries that are seeing they want to phase out fossil fuels. And I think, as I say, there's two basic motivations for that, right? One is ecological reasons, right? The other half of it is that there's dependency, right? We're now seeing very clearly that when you are dependent on fossil fuels, there are these choke points in the global economy that can suddenly impose a huge price shock on your entire economy if you're super dependent on that stuff.
As these middle powers make moves away from dependency on the superpowers, they can surely expect pressure and threats.
When the rules no longer protect you, you must protect yourself.
How might the middle powers do this? Might they even form a security alliance? Gilman thinks not.
What I don't anticipate is that there's going to be a sort of coalition of middle powers, Germany, Brazil, and South Africa forming a security alliance. I don't know what the basis for that would be. Maybe potentially there's some procurement things that could happen, right? If people don't want to be dependent on American military manufacturers, right? They might prefer to purchase things from, European, from Rheinmetall or from Thales or Dassault or whatever, right?
That kind of thing is already happening. The arms trade between middle powers is growing. Europe is the most important military supplier to many countries in the Middle East, Africa and Asia. Look at India buying French fighter jets and German submarines. And Australia is buying warships from Japan. Brazil builds military transport planes for the United Arab Emirates. They have a shared interest in withstanding pressure from the superpowers, but the middle powers may themselves create barriers to a smooth alliance.
So some of those countries do share values as well, not all. So I think that will be one potential point of both solidarity within one group of the middle powers, but potentially also a source of fracture between them. I mean, the kinds of geopolitical differences that we see that are legacies and don't necessarily have anything to do with ecology and metabolics, those things are still there. I mean, there is great power rivalry that exists beyond the kinds of ecological concerns that we're talking about, and there's middle power rivalries, right?
Such rivalries have long plagued Europeans, particularly in attempts to create a common foreign policy. All the more interesting to see what happened in May 2026 at a meeting of the European political community. Leaders like Ursula von der Leyen, Keir Starmer and Volodymyr Zelensky were joined for the first time by a non-European participant, one from across the Atlantic, Mark Carney. Did he go a step further than his Davos speech 3 months before?
We're demonstrating not just the strength of our values in defending the rules-based international order, but also the value of our strength.
Was this a political call to arms for middle powers? For them to feel strong enough to form some kind of a force in this new Cold War? And should they listen?